is on the changing American interests in the Arab countries, the Middle East, and the Islamic world. Implications for American policy. Dr. Anthony, who is known to all members of the Council, is hugely qualified, trained, and oriented toward addressing this particular issue. Dr. Anthony has spoken to the Council before, the first time in 1987. Most of you have been members a long time by then. 1987. He spoke to us during Desert Shield, and he spoke after 9/11, and he spoke in December of '02 before the United States went into Iraq. And he speaks again at a very interesting, too interesting and confusing time of great importance to our nation and beyond. Dr. Anthony has a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from VMI. He received his Master of Science in Diplomacy from the Georgetown School of Foreign Affairs, or Foreign Policy rather, Foreign Service, and his PhD is in International Relations and Middle East Studies from the Johns Hopkins University. He's known in the publicity which we put forward as president, founding president, and CEO of the U.S. Council on Arab-American Relations. Interestingly, he's founded or been head of at least 7 or 8 other significant educational and conflict resolution-oriented organizations related to Middle Eastern affairs. He's the author of 3 books, over 100 monographs and articles on the subject. He's taught at Johns Hopkins, SAIS. He's taught at the University of Texas, Pennsylvania. He's taught at the National Intelligence College. He's briefed at the Department of State, the Department of Defense. He's received awards from both state and defense, unusually impressive awards. He's been knighted by the King Mohammed VI of Morocco, given that nation's highest award for excellence. He's the only non-Arab to be invited to attend each of the summit meetings of the heads of state of the Gulf Coordinating Council since 1981. He knows the Arab world. He's a friend of the Arab world. He's a serious American with a deep interest in foreign policy. It's my enormous pleasure to present the distinguished John Duke Anthony.
Thank you, Dr. Byrd. I can't say how pleased and honored and happy I am to be with you again. I look forward to this each time you've had a cancellation from some other speaker and had to get a substitute there. But showing up is supposed to be 90% of the game there, so you have me again. The area that I'm to focus on this evening could not be more of interest and relevance to America's national interest. It could not be more timely in terms of regional and world affairs. It could not be more relevant in terms of the larger issues of war and peace and life and death. It's also an area that is extraordinarily complicated, and anyone who is confused has no end of company there. And indeed, my own effort to make sense out of it for my own edification and comfort, let alone what I can share with others such as yourselves, has been one long, endless enrollment in a university from which there's no possible graduation. And only on the best of days, as I think I may have indicated before, can I get a bad incomplete. So anyone who comes here and stands before you and is introduced as an expert, that individual must be smoking something pretty good. I've never met an expert in this field, and I say that with no false self-effacement or modesty there. If we had some, we would be in deficit, to be sure, but we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in with no early end in sight or no significant abatement even on the horizon. What I propose to do in the time that we have together is for roughly 30, 35 minutes to lay out what are our interests in the region, what have been our interests in the regions, and why, and then to try to list and rate and rank and compare those interests by categories. And then take your questions and comments or complaints and requests to see if we can have a good discussion here and leave better than before we came. In terms of my effort to understand interest, you may say, well, why that particularly? It's simply because it's interest that policies are supposed to reflect. It's interests that come up in every discussion. It's interests that are the grist for the mill for policymakers. It's interests that are front and center in terms of those who are trying to deal with concept formulation. It's interest in terms of what people are trying to project and to try to protect and try to strengthen and expand. And yet few people define what interests are. But many people use the word interest in an argument or a debate to try to shut somebody else up or to score a point, to say, well, it's not in our interest to do that, or we have to do it because it's in our interest, et cetera. Well, not all interests are the same. And in an effort to try to understand interest a bit more, over the last nearly 40 years, I've tried to discipline myself every 4 years to conduct 20 interviews with people who deal every day with the matter of interest in our policies and to project America's needs, concerns, and objectives and key foreign policy goals abroad. And to see how they define the interest, because we, as their taxpayers, pay their salary and they are obligated to do their utmost here. These 20 have broken down as follows. Usually there are about 4 either members of Congress or their chiefs of staff or their senior defense and foreign policy advisors or their communications and legislative affairs directors who work these issues on the Appropriations Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, the Intelligence Committees, and those dealing with energy, finance, and commerce. In addition to those 4, the balance from the executive branch, about 4 from DOD, about 4 from the Department of State, and 2 each from the Department of Commerce or Treasury, and the balance being those in the public affairs or public diplomacy business there. And so what I will share with you is what they have shared with me, and I would like to sort of run through this up to the Bush administration, to show continuity, to show context, to give background, to give perspective, so that we can impose a degree of intellectual and analytical discipline and order on what otherwise would be hopelessly confusing to most of us there. The interests are as follows in terms of categories of interest now. One is an overarching set of strategic interests, that these have to do with issues of war and peace and stability and security and prosperity and people's ability to plan and anticipate and predict to pursue other interests than those that relate directly to war and peace. The second interest that has been a constant for the last 30 years, 31 years to be precise, a set of economic interest. The economic interest and the business interest used to be under the same tent until after 73, 74, the last Arab oil embargo. Now they're separated out. They have been separated out since then as a set of economic interest in terms of having sheer access to the region's resources, and particularly those of oil and gas, energy, fossil fuels, hydrocarbons that grow our economy, that are arguably amongst vital commodities traded worldwide, certainly the 4th after air that one breathes, water that one drinks, food that one eats. I'm hard-pressed to come up with the 4th commodity upon which all societies, all economies, all countries, weak and strong, big and small, new and old, depend upon for their material well-being and their growth. So the sheer access to it, leave aside production levels, leave aside pricing levels, leave aside concessions, leave aside international law, leave aside science and technology, et cetera. The sheer access to it. Some have made the analogy of like an addictive access. So be it, but that's the reality of it. A third one, in descending order, is a set of political interests, because Only two places in the entire region now remain in quest of their national sovereignty, their political independence, their territorial integrity, and this is the Western Sahara on the one hand and the people of Palestine on the other. But with regard to all the others, there is the interchange of treaties and meetings and summits and seminars and intelligence and shadowy third-party good offices, diplomacy efforts to try to push the participants' agenda as far and effectively and successfully as is possible there. This is where we have our greatest problem and difficulties. There is a fourth category of commercial interests that have been separated out from the economic interests, and this has to do with the ability of ourselves through our policies, our positions, through our actions, our attitudes, through our energy, our time, our efforts, our prowess, to export our goods and services and products to the region, and thereby lower this increasingly costly and onerous, burdensome oil import, gas import, energy import bill that is necessary to grow our economy and to even maintain our economy. Fifth, rather, to the surprise of some, has been, up until this administration, a set of defense interests there in terms of bases, in terms of understandings, in terms of defense cooperation agreements, in terms of access to facilities, in terms of maneuvers, in terms of joint exercises, in terms of procurement, in terms of standards, in terms of specifications, in terms of strategic doctrine and tactical doctrine on military plateaus. And sixth and lastly, but the one over which more words have been uttered and ink spilled is the interest of democratization, or the increasing of the popular participation of people in their systems of government and political dynamics. I put this one sixth because I'm speaking as frankly as I can. Put under the microscope, this particular last interest has been the one that has been the most psychologically indulgable and politically preferable, but at the end of the day, the one that's been the most expendable. Now let's go back and look at these six from another perspective there. I've given sort of categories of interest in their descending order of priority there, based on my truthful reflection of the consensus of those to whom I asked the question, why are we doing what we're doing in the region, and how are we doing, and what are the costs and what are the benefits there. With respect to tallying those up, some people use more judgmental words. I think nouns and verbs are strong words, action verbs, words, but adjectives and adverbs are usually emotional words and betray a degree of personal preference and sometimes weakness there. But there is another way to look at interest, because not all interests are the same. Some are vital. This is a word we never used until 1974. The British did for at least a century and a half before we did. The French did for at least a century and a half before we did. But we began to use the word vital, meaning that we would fight for this. We would mobilize. We would deploy. We would commit troops. We would commit treasure. We would die if we had to, in order to protect that interest or to pursue that particular interest. So there are some vital interests for us, but less than half a century have we been calling them vital. And then there are those that are very important, but not quite vital. Very important would be the opening or the closure of the Suez Canal, or the blockage of the Hormuz Straits, or the exit and entrance to the southern part of the Red Sea. We've lived with this before. The Suez Canal has been shut twice. We paid a heavy price. Europe paid a heavier price. Egypt paid still a heavier price. But we live with this in spite of the fact that the canal was closed there. And then there are some that are important in terms of stability, in terms of regional receptivity and the moment being propitious for investments, for trade, for technology cooperation, for the establishment of joint ventures. And then there are those that are sort of major there in terms of students coming here and being inculcated with American values and institutions, beliefs and principles and ideals and norms of behavior and organization and leadership and commitment and courage and conviction. We feel emotionally about these. We feel idealistically about these. We're educators in this regard, and we can see the relationship between cause and effect and how this helps us in the future there. So that's another way of looking at these interests by categories and by rating and ranking and by value as such. Now, before this administration, how were we doing? Let's go back to the first ones there in terms of strategy with regard to war and peace. We worked overwhelmingly positively and successfully and effectively with the overwhelming majority of the peoples and countries and governments of these three regions, the Arab countries, the Middle East, and the Islamic world, throughout the Cold War. These were bulwarks. These were buttresses. These were people who brought a hell of a lot to the table in facing atheistic, godless communism. And we were the net beneficiaries of this, as they themselves were the net beneficiaries of adjoining forces and hands with them there. We cooperated, we collaborated, we coordinated effectively and successfully through several wars. The Iran-Iraq War, one of the longest wars in the last century, from 1980 to August 1988. We helped to reverse the aggression by Iraq against Kuwait to restore safety and dignity and sovereignty to the Kuwaiti people. We upheld the UN Charter for a change in terms of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. We also brought to an end the longest-standing Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. We brought the Red Army to its knees, and then thereby we helped to add one of the final straws together that broke the proverbial camel's back in terms of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We even collaborated, albeit shadowy, in the covert realm in terms of conflicts in Latin America. And we collaborated also in terms of some of the long-term, still works in progress success stories in the Balkans, in the aftermath of Bosnia and Serbia and Herzegovina and Kosovo and Albania as such. At the present time, it's an open question as to whether there's been more success than failure. I think the consensus would be there's been more failure than success. With regard to the economic aspect, since March 13th, 1974, which was when the last Arab oil embargo was effective, we have secured that strategic interest in terms of having access to the region's oil and gas. And we remain, as we were then, as we are now, and as we will likely remain for the foreseeable future, the world's single largest consumers of this finite, depletable asset. We are the planet's single largest importers of it. We're the single loudest crybabies about it in terms of what we have to pay for it, comparison to what we'd have to pay for it if we moved tonight to Rotterdam or to Brussels or to Antwerp or Tokyo or to London and asked to fill it up. We'd see that in a millisecond there. And we are the single biggest wasters of this particular finite, depletable resource upon which all of humanity thrives and survives and relies and depends. And so much in terms of the moralistic or the ethical aspect of democracy in terms of one person, one vote, or one person, one right, one share. We're 5% of the world's people, but we daily consume 40% of that particular product as such. In other words, we're consuming 8 times more than our fair share. If you look at this from a moralistic or an ethical perception, the British are consuming 3 times their share, if you look at it from that perspective. The Chinese are not even consuming a third of their rightful share in terms of people related to this particular resource, and yet we're scared to death in terms of their consuming that much because it's taking away that much from what it is that we insist that we continue to have access to. With regard to the political aspect, this is the most problematic and fraught with difficulty and danger of all of the categories of interest, and this is the one where our prestige has been diminished the most, where our national interests have been harmed the greatest, where our image, our role, our respectability, our acceptability, our utility in regional and world affairs has been hit the hardest. Much of it through self-inflicted wounds. We cannot blame this upon others as such. We've shown an exceptional itchy trigger finger in terms of shooting ourselves in the foot and an inordinate capacity to reload faster than anyone else in this particular regard. We'll come back to that in a minute. But on the commercial side, the news is better than the media or the mainstream think tanks and commentary and punditocracy would imply there, in the sense that before this administration, we were number one in the markets of the countries that mattered, particularly the oil and gas producing economies in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Persian Gulf, and we are still number one And number one is to be prized and cherished and protected amongst the 212 countries in the world. If you look at it from a different perspective, though, a multilateral one, say from the European Union has twice the share of the market that we have, and therefore there's no reason to try to be resting on our laurels in that regard. And they are hungrier, they're more ambitious, they're more understanding, they're more empathetic, they're more respectful, and they work harder at securing access to these markets than do we. And let's just say, if I can be inventive with language here, they are less encumbered with legislative impedimenta in terms of marketing prowess to have access to these markets, where we have three particular pieces of legislation that we passed back in the 1970s, and we thought that everybody would follow us. Well, to be a leader, you can't be a leader unless you have followers. Not a single country on the planet has followed us in terms of those three pieces of legislation that make it difficult for us to have investment in robust trading and commercial partnerships in that part of the world. And I can tell you that the other 211 countries in the world hope that we do not eradicate those three laws as such, because these are the great American relief acts for Canada, for Ireland, for Great Britain, for China, for Russia, for Japan, for Korea, for Taiwan, and many another country that competes with us in the particular region there. So the commercial aspect is better than one would imagine. The World Trade Organization has been heavily dominated in terms of its leadership and its imprint by us. The World Bank remains this way. The International Monetary Fund remains this way. And the exports of the region continue to be denominated in our currency, not somebody else's. This has to do with the ongoing preeminence of the American financial system worldwide, the acceptability, the respectability, and the strength of the dollar, and we do not want to see this change. Although there are rumblings about switching to the euro, or there are rumblings about having a basket of currencies, or there are rumblings about having a sliding formula of, let's say, paying $70 for a barrel of oil and only $40 of it being in America's currency, and the other 30 of it being a mixture of pound sterling, French francs, Swiss francs, Dutch guilders, South African kougarans, and the like. We do not want this to happen, but there's a tilt and a dynamism balanced in that particular direction. On the defense side, we still have more than any other two or three countries, greater understandings, greater agreements, greater undertakings, greater access, greater presences, greater degrees of dynamism in terms of working in our armed services institutions for prepositioning equipment, for having exercises, for sharing information, for sharing intelligence, and particularly in the vital region of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. Because those six countries of Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman look out towards Iraq and Iran. And Iraq alone, with its population just under 30 million, is greater than all six of them combined. And Iran alone is greater than that population of all of them, 3 times as great. And because there's no longer a bipolar superpower world, we are the sole power upon whom they can rely with a degree of credibility to deter, to contain, and if deterrence and containment doesn't work, to protect and defend them against an ambitious move by either Baghdad or Tehran. And having taken Baghdad off the table in terms of a threat to them, indeed, Iran is unchecked in their eyes with regard to an exceptionally emboldened Iran. Indeed, at the Heads of State Summit that I attended in December 18th, 19th in Abu Dhabi this past year, a joke going around all the summiteers was that the United States militarily attacked Iraq and Iran won. And Iran won without firing a single bullet, without shedding a single drop of blood. And it may come off as in jest or tongue-in-cheek as such, but the reality is just what I stated there, and the implications of it for our needs, for our concerns, for our interests, for our policies, for our strategies are enormous, and no one seems to have a clear hand on this as such. Now let's go back to, in the remaining minutes that we have, and look at what has happened under this particular administration since its coming into office and the incumbency of the White House there. We have a situation where war has become more the norm than the exception or the aberration there. We have a situation where a word that was not part of most people's vocabulary in terms of neoconservatives now is pretty much a household word. We have a situation where we had the greatest financial, economic, budgetary surplus in the history of our republic that has become now the greatest single frame of reference to becoming the greatest and historically most indebted nation and peoples on the planet, all within less than half a decade. We have a situation where we worked harder and better and more successfully and effectively than anyone to establish the norms for interstate relations and the norms of international legitimacy and organization and law. Where we have seen a situation of high-ranking officials all the way up to the top there looking with disdain and callous dismay and ridicule upon those institutions, those norms, those beliefs, those concepts, those laws that were put in place for the previous half century there. You have a situation where we are the sole superpower, the sole hyperpower there, and there is no one really effectively that we believe can oppose us there. And this has inculcated a degree of arrogance and ignorance and brashness and intrusiveness and interference and deafness and lack of empathy, the likes of which I think few of us had seen prior to 5.5 years ago. If this seems overly partisan as a statement from my side, I confess that it is, but it's my conclusion, it's my assessment, it's my analysis. I wish it were the opposite. I would love to be proven wrong. Here in the case of Iraq, what have we done? Freeze that question for a second and consider or ponder, if you will, the following. That all heads of state, all governments, all executive branches, whether they're dictatorial, authoritarian, pluralistic, representative, democratic, parliamentary, what have you, are looking over their shoulders and looking through the front windshield as well to see how they are scoring with regard to 4 things that are the mandates for all heads of state. One of these is the following. To do one's utmost to ensure domestic safety, domestic security, internal security, so that people do not have to leave their homes or leave their cars packing heat or looking over their shoulder or having bodyguards or force protection on the tip of their lips. Secondly, has to do with external defense in terms of keeping those who are neighbors, who are greedy, who are avaricious, who are covetous, who would love to have your titanium mine on their side of the border, love to have your river on their side of the border, love to have your oil or gas field on their side of the border, and are waiting for the time when you're sleeping or distracted otherwise in order to bring that asset onto their side of the border. So the external defense aspect there. Here we are in a situation with regard to Iraq that had no foreign illegal immigrants coming into Iraq, let alone any foreigners as such. And here we have structured a situation where we talk about the foreign jihadis. We make a big issue out of it as though their numbers are legion. And yet this has been the irresponsibility or the abdication of responsibility of the truth sayers in our media as such, because the total is not even now, after 1,000 days of our being in Iraq as invaders and occupiers, the total even now is less than what comes across our borders illegally in one day, okay? With regard to 1,000 days that we've had, you can multiply that indeed by 1,000. With respect to the third pillar here, namely people's material well-being and their feeling that the situation is such that they can improve their lot, they can improve their children's lot, that they can have a roof over their head, that they can have clothing on their back, they can have food on their table, they can have their children in school, they can have access to health care and medical services, that they can have a life of material dignity and advancement and opportunity. This aspect is also what heads of state are judged in. We're talking about a situation of nearly 60% unemployment in Iraq, where few, if any, can plan with the degree that everyone in this room here this evening can plan and predict and anticipate and be reasonably assured of attaining their particular goals. And with regard to the fourth one, an effective civil, diplomatic, peaceful, guaranteed system of justice, so that people do not have to take revenge into their hands and act out their emotional humiliations and indignities on the altar of bias and humiliation and degradation and sectarian bias and prejudice and ethnic cleansing and political opposition. This aspect, too, was there before, but is missing. That's 4. And then take 3 others, and namely the criteria to be a member, to remain a member of the United Nations, namely to show and demonstrate convincingly that you are nationally sovereign, that you're politically independent, and that your territory is intact. We took all 3 of those off the table, too. We dispensed with all 7 of these constants. These constants apply to us as well as they apply to any other governments in the world. And this is part and parcel for the diminution of respect and admiration for American institutions, beliefs, practices, and values and ideals in the last 5 years, and particularly in the last 3 years. With respect to Iraq and Iran and Israel, these would be amongst all the other countries, the 22 Arab countries, the 28 Middle Eastern countries, the 57 Islamic countries, somewhat more neonized, italicized, and capitalized than the others there. This does not mean that because all 3 of them start with I, that the I's have it. But in the case of Iran, we're sitting in a situation where no one in this room, myself not least amongst them, can tell you what is likely to happen. But many of the same people that brought what we have in front of us in Iraq are still in power, still in office. We have nearly 3 years left in this regard. Only less than a handful have departed. And their goals remain similar to what they were before. I cannot count or recall the number of meetings I sat in on as a consultant to DOD, consultant to state, and a member of various think tanks and asked to attend various meetings where it looked as though the turkey had already been cooked in an oven nearly 10 years ago in terms of what was in store for us in Iraq. I was appointed to a national commission in the mid-1990s of 23 people to revisit our strategy of dual containment towards Iran and Iraq. Of the 23 of us, 20 had never been to the region, set foot in the region. The 3 of us that had were consistently ignored, overlooked. We would be acknowledged from time to time, but were never engaged. We would raise our hands at the beginning of a briefer as such, and we would be the last to be called upon. And sometimes when we would be called upon, somebody would say, wait a minute, I think it's time to take a break. Wait a minute, now it's time to have dinner as such. And so no one in a position of decision-making or policy-making authority can say in truth that they were not aware of people saying, are you fully aware of what you're getting into here in terms of the necessity of it? We're not talking about dredging clogged up rivers. We're not talking about building refineries. We're not talking about constructing highways. We're not talking about rebuilding airports. We're not talking about design and procurement and construction as such. This can be done. This is almost universalistic in terms of skills and talents and abilities there. We're talking about judgments based on information that's built up over decades of specialization in terms of tribes, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religious groups, in terms of sex, in terms of minorities, in terms of regions, in terms of subregions, in terms of towns and villages and hamlets and municipalities, in terms of language. And the sad aspect of this is out of our 300 million people, prior to going into Iraq on March the 19th, 2003, we had no more than 6 Americans who could have a conversation for up to 40 minutes on what I just ran through. And why, you would say, is this the case? Because it's not the case in terms of Iran. In the case of Iran, it's the exact opposite. It's because from June 67, during the last big Arab-Israeli conflict, 8 Arab countries broke diplomatic relations with us, and we had no one in Baghdad from June 67 until January of 1984. No one. We had 2 people playing a low-profile role in what was called the American interest section of the Belgian embassy in Baghdad, who were constricted as to what they could do and where they could go and how far they could venture outside of Baghdad itself. From 1984, when I took 5 congressional delegations to Iraq and met with the ambassadors and country team each time, and the defense and foreign ministers, we never had more than 16 people in the country all together. The ambassador, deputy chief of mission, political economic officer, public affairs, cultural affairs officer, the defense intelligence agency, there, the spooky people, the station chief there, and the private sector. Never more than 16 if they were all there one day. And then from November or the autumn of 1990 until March 19th of 2003, we had again 0 in Iraq. Now, I would submit to you there that Wolfowitz never had been to Iraq, Pearl had never been to Iraq, Fife had never been to Iraq, Rumsfeld had been twice, a total of 4 days to Iraq, but Cheney had never been to Iraq there. Most of America's decision makers had never been to Iraq. Now, I ask you, if someone was offering you property in Dallas, would you buy it without going to Dallas to see what Dallas was like, seeing if there were building codes, restrictions, liens on the property, what the city council's makeup was like, and what the laws, the rules, the regulation were that could possibly apply to your property? No, you wouldn't. And you would think anybody who didn't would be ignorant and reckless in the extreme. But this is what we did in the extreme there. So we shouldn't be surprised. We talked about expanding the space for secularism in the region and the atmosphere and the climate supportive of separations between church and state. And here what we have done is the exact opposite. We've dealt a setback to that particular cause. We've dealt a setback to women's empowerment. We've dealt a setback thus far for women's rights, for civil rights. And more particularly, what we have done, if I can break it down into 4 groups, because many people think conspiratorially and they have sort of a silver bullet and say, this group brought us this, that group brought us this. I think it's a combination of things, a feeling of superiority to the rest of humanity and all the other countries on the planet in the wake of the ending of the Cold War successfully in our favor, and the hubris and the arrogance and the ignorance and the conceit that went along with this. I think a lot of it has to do with the emotionalism in the aftermath of 9/11, particularly with regard to how so many Americans to this day apparently believe that it was Saddam Hussein in Iraq that brought us 9/11, not Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And the understandable, morally questionable feelings of revenge that we owed it, we deserve this, this was right for us to do this. And thirdly, a set of ideological interest of believing that our form of democratic government, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. There's no democracy on the face of the earth. There never has been one. Read Madison's number 10 in the Federalist Papers, saying straight out, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Power separated in executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and we're ruled by a set of laws there. But there are those who believe in it fervently, and I respect them, and I've worked with them, and I've been on missions with them to other countries to try to advance that particular agenda there. But many believe it's the end-all and the catch-all and the be-all and the panacea for what ails humanity and what ails our relationship with the rest of the world. And then a fourth group, they're simply interested in power, the will to power. If the continuity of comfort is a seductive thing, then the acquisition and the retention of power is an addictive thing. These are the 4 main schools of thought that drove this particular aspect. More than the Israeli aspect, although that was involved. More than the moneyed aspect of the big banks and financial houses and the so-called aerospace defense industry and the Bechtels and the Halliburtons and the Fluors and the Kellogg, Brown and Roots, et cetera. Those are, to be sure, were involved, and I sat in on many meetings in which they were hardly shy or taciturn in terms of articulating the interests. But I see it in these other 4 larger categories. Let me stop here. It's at 35 minutes. I said I would be here 35 minutes and take your questions for the remainder of the time. Thank you. Because of the nature of technology and equipment and systems, I will do my best to restate anyone's question before answering it. And I prefer to take a number of questions before I respond. This way it allows more people to participate and be involved, and it also helps to discipline my tongue. What can an ordinary American citizen do to support change? And obviously to be engaged, to be involved. I would make the case that it's everyone who's a citizen's civic obligation, their moral duty to do something organizationally, programmatically, to try to make her or his voice heard, and make her or his voice heard in the right place at the right time for the right reasons. We have a saying that democracy is not a spectator sport. If you want to get results, you have to participate. If you do not participate, if you do not engage, if you do not get involved, you have yourself first and foremost to blame for the paucity of results or the unsavory results. And this may sound too simplistic there, but I've taken more than 220 members of Congress, their chiefs of staff, to the region there, and they all tell me that they will return your telephone calls and notes more than they will return mine. I living in Washington, you living here as such. So that part, in every senator and every congresswoman or man comes home to their districts. They have a district right here in Baltimore. They have ones in Annapolis and elsewhere. And you're as free as anybody else to call that number tomorrow and say, when is he coming? When is she coming next? And I'm a voter. I'm a citizen. I'm a taxpayer. I want to, I demand to be able to meet with her or to see her or to see him or to see you as a prelude to that. And they would, in every case that I'm aware of, would be responsive. I know it's intimidating. I know it seems awkward the first time if you've never done it. I know you may think, well, I'm just one person. It won't make a difference. I can tell you it'll make every difference in the world if you're serious about it and you do follow up on this. Why did W win the election in 2000? Well, the vote was 5-4, and the Supreme Court, in an unprecedented thing, that's the technical answer, that's the truthful answer, that's the legal answer, that's the constitutional answer there. But we do know, it seems to be a consensus that Gore had the popular vote there. This is not the first time in history where, because of the peculiarities of electoral systems, and winner-take-all systems whereby in a state like California, if you get 51% of the vote, you get all of its electoral votes there, that you can come up with a result such as that. Our system is such that of 50 states, you can lose 43 and win 7, and if they are the right 7, you can win. So this is one of the anomalies that not too many other countries, if any, have followed, to the best of my knowledge there. The latest developments in Israel with regard to unilateral withdrawal from Gaza and talk about additional unilateral withdrawals and fixing Israel's borders. This is part of the problem, not exactly part of the solution. If I was an Israeli, I could resonate to it. In the sense of it looking to be decisive, it looking to be as though we're controlling our own agenda in terms of maximizing our own self-proclaimed interest. But reality is a little bit more complex than that, especially when you've been in occupation of another people since June 1967, especially when there have been 76 separate peace processes since 1947, 48, 49. I know our president said in the last 2 years that 60 years of missed opportunities, and Abba Eban used to get a nice chuckle out of audiences when he would say the only thing that Palestinians are famous for is that they never lose an opportunity to lose an opportunity. And people will chuckle at that, but I think the reverse side of the coin is equally on our side. We have not missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity to make major progress in peace, and a just peace, a durable peace, a comprehensive peace, to put this single oldest peace that hurts us in the region, the single biggest peace that hurts us in the region, the single most pervasive peace that hurts us in the region to this day, in the rearview mirror. But I don't see it in the short run. On the contrary, I see pretty much the opposite here. I see this particular president, for whom I will be truth in laboring, saying I voted for him, okay, as did my wife, okay, for reasons I thought were sound and sage and wise and sagacious at the time, but I see differently now, okay. With this particular president, though, he's the first that we've had that has stated as a matter of policy that Israel will not have to return all of the ill-gotten, illicit, illegally acquired territories from the Palestinians. Verbatim. This is the first president who has said that Resolution 191 with regard to the right of Palestinian refugees to return or be compensated is not one that his administration is prepared to endorse or uphold, despite the fact that we did precisely that in Bosnia. We did precisely that in Kosovo. We did precisely that in East Timor. Okay? With respect to the Israeli situation, it's precarious in many, many ways. The number of Jewish people on the planet are between 13 million and 15 million. The figure has not budged in the last quarter of a century there, versus 2 billion Christians, 1.3 Muslims. And so the three monotheistic faiths and believers and adherents who believe in a sky god, which are half of humanity there, are in this situation where Israel is not just in the minority, its numbers are tinier than minuscule, okay? And because of the media and the internet and television and the proliferation of satellite stations in the last several years, people outside the United States see far more of this in graphic, illustrative, dramatic detail than we do, okay? And so this has taken the position, the emblematic symbol of the Israeli survivors of the Holocaust and the pogroms and the concentration camps and the extermination camps, the injustices dealt to an entire people down through the ages, and the empathy and the sympathy and the identification with that victimhood. It has been vitiated, and now it's as much affixed to the Palestinians as it used to be unquestionably and extensively with regard to the Israelis. And this cannot be good for Israel. And the aspects in terms of democracy, or the statement that it's our only friend in the region, this grows a bit wearying, a bit tiresome there, especially when you put it under the microscope and you see the degree of dynamism and political dynamics and systems of governments and political structures elsewhere in the region. Mind you, nowhere is an extension of nirvana, and none of these polities are bereft of blemish. But in terms of Israel's mileage regarding democracy as such, free people, I don't think, put other people in Bantustans who are helpless and whose land and homes were taken from them. Free people anywhere, I believe, do not violate international law. Free people anywhere do not do the opposite of upholding everybody's innate sense in quest for dignity and home and family and peace and security and stability and justice. With regard to Israel's actions towards Iran, what might they be? It seems to change by the hour if I read my internet and alternate media sources and attend meetings on this. Here's a big dilemma. Many are speaking of appeasement, that one cannot let Iran get away with this, that one cannot take Iran at its word, that it is unacceptable in our head of state's language and the Israeli defense minister's language that Iran should become a nuclear power. I'm not sure appeasement is where I am conceptually, although I relate to it, and I know well what Munich represented and Neville Chamberlain's tapping with his cane and his top hat in the 30s with regard to Germany's move into its neighboring territories there. And we don't want to go down that road again. But we said the same things. I've been around long enough with regard to the Islamic bomb in terms of Pakistan. I remember being in debate after debate in the 60s and 70s. We can't let them have it. Well, they do have it, and we accommodate it. Our president accommodated it, and India has it, and our president has accommodated that. So I'm not buying into yet that we're at appeasement's door, per se. A lot is possible. It's possible remotely that the United States could conclude a treaty arrangement with the 6 GCC countries and any others who wanted to join, guaranteeing their defense against an attack by Iran. That's not completely out of the question. It's something that our aerospace and defense and our power mill people and our chiefs of staff have had under reasonably active consideration and positive orientation for the last 3 decades. I wouldn't rule something like that out. And certainly Iran doesn't have one. No one seems to think that they would have one within 2 years, and a number think it's between 5 to 10 years. Carnegie's Joseph Ciracione is one that believes that even if they went hell for leather, from now forward, they would be lucky if they could get a weapon inside of 5 years. So I would look at time as of the essence here, and time providing additional opportunities for creativity. There's certainly no overwhelmingly, imminently urgent case to be made that either the United States or Israel or the two together should militarily attack Iran at this time. I find the evidence lacking and the logic not persuasive as such. But I can see it from an Israeli perspective, because the Israelis would say, well, look, my goodness, they're behind Hamas, they're behind Islamic Jihad, they're behind Hezbollah. They have a president, Ahmadinejad, who talks about wiping us off the map as such. And what more do we need that we should take this government out, have regime change there right now without further haste? I have to say that in a number of the meetings that I attended and participated prior to the invasion of Iraq, March 19, 2003, there were high-ranking officials and former officials who said we had it upside down, inside out, and backwards, that we should invade Iran first. Iraq could come second. And there were others that said, no, we should have Syria first, and the other two could be second and third. And then there are some who look at Saudi Arabia and they look at Egypt. Egypt because one of 4 Arabs on the planet is an Egyptian. And Saudi Arabia because of what it is, who it is, where it is, and what it does in terms of 1.3 billion Muslims. So the same people who ran those meetings that I sat in are still in place, still in position. And many of them think that they have already accomplished a fair amount of their objectives. Now, you and I may say, how on earth could they conclude thusly? Well, I can tell you, having sat in on meetings with them, that their adamancy on changing the regime in Iraq was the overriding strategic objective, and that was essential to other objectives. And other objectives included the United States being able to place our citizens, our consultants, our advisors inside various Iraqi ministries where the mega billion-dollar contracts would eventually be let for oil and gas and pipelines and refineries and concessions, where additional Americans would be consultants and advisors in the Iraqi ministries that would help to reconstruct the country in terms of its highways, refineries, waterways, schools, and the like. And that yet another element saw that this was the only way that they could be on the inside, where policies and decisions were made that would privatize Iraq's economy there and lower the tax rate per corporate entity and serve as a bellwether, an example for other countries in the region. And still other meetings that I sat where the quest was to bring Iraq to its knees as the second most powerful player in OPEC, and to deal a sock to the chops to a country that seriously considered switching from the dollar to the euros. And I sat in other meetings that wanted to deprive Israel of one of its most ardent, arduous, fervent enemies there. And still other meetings that wanted to stop the Iraqi government's financial, political, and moral support for the Palestinian resistance. And still other meetings where there were those who wanted to break up Iraq into 3 sectors at least, and to not so much uphold the country's national sovereignty and political independence and territorial integrity as to deal it a blow and to break it up into its component parts, to have a confederation. And related to that last one, access to energy phenomena. That is to say, as of today, we don't have a single legal foot on which to stand with regard to Iraq's oil or gas resources. But the Russians do. The French do. The Chinese do. The Russians and the French have sovereign signed concession agreements. We have nothing. The Chinese have initialed agreements. We don't have anything. And so there is another element, going back to the early 1990s, that came up with the dual containment of Iraq and Iran, that also looked down the road in a strategy called 2020, aptly named because it was visionary. But the question put was, what must America have to have in place by 2020 AD in order to remain the world's sole superpower? And the answers were threefold: that we must continue to be industrially strong, technologically strong, and financially strong. And the key to all three of those was energy. And the key to the energy component was the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. We are the single largest consumers of this. We consume 20 million barrels a day. We import more than we would produce. Of our nearly 8 million barrels a day that have been produced for the last 10 years, we get it from 650,000 wells, every one of them driven by a pump. Saudi Arabia, which produces now 9.5 million barrels a day, ratcheting up to 12 million barrels a day by 2009, gets its 9.5 million barrels a day from only 1,000 wells. The average production of an American well being 12 barrels a day, the average production of a Saudi Arabian well being 12,000 barrels a day. And none of theirs are driven with a pump. When they find it, which is frequently, that challenge is to keep it in the ground. When we find it, which is seldom, is to get it out of the ground. They have 61 oil fields. They have only produced from 21. They have 40 that they have never even touched, okay? One of their oil fields has more oil in it than all of the oil in the United States and Canada and Europe combined. Their second field has half as much oil in it as all the oil fields in the United States, Canada, and Europe combined. So there is this element that recognizes that the last century was the American century. This century, according to the pundits, is supposed to be the Asian century of China's, maybe also India's there. But there are those all over the world and throughout history who've wanted to remain number one as long as they could. And so there is a blocking aspect, not just necessarily or only America's acquisition of these resources, but to deny it to those who would compete with us. And this is part of the 2020 vision, to not allow any other competitor that would contest our status as the world's sole hyperpower. And this is achieved not by accident and not by coincidence, but by some of the actions, some of the policies, some of the positions, some of the attitudes that you've seen in the last 3 years, with Iran being in front of us, Syria over the horizon, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, I'm afraid, down the road.
John, we thank you so much. I mean, it's been extraordinarily stimulating, thoroughly enjoyable. It's what sessions like this are meant to be. We're in your debt once more. Thanks so much.
Thank you.